Holy shit!
For as long as human beings have told stories, we have invented worlds that do not exist. We have imagined portals to supernatural realms, paradisal fields, islands of the undying, civilizations on distant planets, palaces under the sea, gateways to hell. But in modern times, we have brought the subterranean hellscape to the surface in one of our most popular made-up worlds, the dystopia. From classic literature like Brave New World in 1984 or Fahrenheit 451 to more recent, massively popular book series, which have been adapted into box office powerhouses, alongside enduring cult classics, as well as too many video games to mention. For 100 years now, we have been fascinated by nightmare visions of environmental disasters, squalor, societal decline, or tyrannical governments maintaining complete control over a society, whether through brute force, propaganda, censorship, denial of free thought, brainwashing, or all of the above, leading to a complete loss of individuality. But in this ever-expanding genre, there is one dystopian film that stands out as horrifyingly unique, breaking the mold and creating a dystopian world unlike any other, except maybe, potentially, our own. Stanley Kubrick's 1971 film adaptation of A Clockwork Orange follows the deviant peregrinations of a young criminal named Alex Delarge as he navigates a dystopian version of London, England, where, unlike more conventional dystopias, where the authoritarian government maintains more or less perfect control of the populace through various means, in A Clockwork Orange, we encounter a society that is simultaneously authoritarian.
The police are fond of bringing their victims to the outskirts of this village,
while also being rampant with crime. We see this firsthand as the film starts off like John Wayne giving a swimming lesson, throwing us headlong into the deep end with a demonetizable scene in a bar that sells milk laced with drugs, invoking the sense of an almost paradisal society, flowing with milk and honey. A society that has nevertheless descended into an erotic debauchery that rivals the licentiousness of the most decadent Romans. The whole purpose of the drug-laced milk is to sharpen up Alex and his gang of droogs for a night of recreational violence. We watch as Alex and the gang commit a series of increasingly heinous crimes, beating a homeless man, fighting a rival gang, and breaking into a home where they mercilessly beat and assault the inhabitants. It's clear that this is a world of gangs, poverty, and matter-of-fact crime, in which a series of violent acts can be committed not only in one night, but over a series of nights, even against the middle and upper classes of society, and the criminals can get away with it again and again, night after night.
It's a stinky world because there's no law and order anymore. It's a stinky world because it lets the young get onto the old, like you dog.
But if it really is true that there is no law and order, then we might be surprised to learn that this is actually not an anarchist society, nor is it even a disintegrating society ruled by a crumbling government. In fact, it is a heavily authoritarian society. Not only is police brutality ubiquitous, but halfway through the film, we are told that the prisons are in fact overflowing, as more and more people are arrested and imprisoned. Yet, the streets are not safe, nor are people safe in their own homes. Despite the mass incarceration of criminals, for every deviant locked up, another one seems to appear. And it's this problem that leads the government to use experimental techniques to try and rehabilitate criminals, taking away their very ability to commit crimes, or to choose to commit crimes, so that the government can have a safe, crime-free society on the one hand, and also on the other hand have more room in their prisons for political prisoners.
What we need are larger prisons, more money.
Not a chance, my dear fellow. The government can't be concerned any longer with outmoded penological theories. Soon we may be needing all our prison space for political offenders.
Thus, A Clockwork Orange exists in a world of contradictions. On the one hand, It is a democratic society which holds elections, yet it's also simultaneously authoritarian, where political dissidents are outright jailed. The government is anti-fascist, conditioning criminals to hate Nazism, while employing experimental scientific techniques which would have made any Nazi scientist or Unit 731 scientist proud. But perhaps the most surprising paradox of all, simply because we wouldn't expect it, is that despite being thoroughly draconian, this society is still thoroughly steeped in brutal and horrifying ultraviolence. Authoritarianism might mean a lack of freedom for most people in society, but it doesn't mean a lack of crime. It's perfectly possible for the worst of both worlds to exist side by side, and for human rights to be violated from the bottom up and the top down simultaneously. In fact, this is often the case, which is one of the things that makes Kubrick's vision feel so authentic. The question we're left with, though, is why? Why doesn't the authoritarian government of A Clockwork Orange work? Why is it unable to create the kind of society that either the people in power or even the voting public want to live in? While the film doesn't give us a direct answer, it does give us a handful of hints. From the nature of policing and government corruption that is portrayed, to the quality of its culture and the character of its citizens. In the first really comical scene of the film, we're introduced to Alex's probation officer, who complains about how they've been studying the problem of delinquency for a century, but presumably they can't figure out how to eliminate the problem of crime.
Well, we study the problem. We've been studying it for damn well near a century, yes, but we get no further with our studies. You've got a good home here, good loving parents. You've got not too bad of a brain. Is it some devil that crawls inside of you?
The signature Kubrickian irony of the scene is that the probation officer himself is a total sleazebag. Should we really be surprised that creeps can't figure out how to curtail adolescent delinquency? Of course, it's not until Alex is later arrested for murder that we see how scummy the police really are. When Alex defiantly refuses to speak without a lawyer present while being interrogated, saying that he knows the law and he knows his rights, the interrogating officers respond that they know the law too, and that knowing the law isn't everything, at which point they proceed to torture their suspect. Why would we expect there to be law and order when the authorities use their power to coerce and control people in ways that have nothing to do with law or with order? The reality is that when police don't follow the law, the only thing that separates them from criminals is a change of clothes. A connection that the film overtly draws attention to in its second half, when we learn that two of Alex's former droogs have become police officers. It seems that when adolescent criminals grow up and become old enough for a job, this is their ideal vocation, especially in a world where police and criminals alike routinely ignore the law. As for Alex himself, he is destined for higher office than that of a police officer, which only makes sense because as the leader of a gang, he is a kind of dictator who dresses like a 20th century politician and governs his droogs not with structured rules but with capricious outbursts and physical force.
Now they knew who was master and leader. Sheep, thought I. But a real leader knows always when to give and show generous to his unders.
A micro-government unto himself, an absolute monarch who answers to no law of man or nature outside of himself, prosecuting acts of evil, exploiting peaceful people, and waging war on rival gangs. Being a true autocrat, the natural progression of his plot arc is that, rather than becoming a cop, he would have a more political career through cutting a deal with the government itself to help the authoritarian regime maintain its power. While Stanley Kubrick was often guarded about the interpretation of his films, often refusing to comment on what they truly mean, he was actually pretty open about the meaning of A Clockwork Orange, willing to lay out his own philosophy on the nature of the world, saying things like, "The government eventually resorts to the employment of the cruelest and most violent members of the society to control everyone else, not an altogether new or untried idea." In this sense, Alex's last line, "I was cured all right," might be seen in the same light as Dr. Strangelove's exit line, "Mein Führer, I can walk." The final images of Alex as the spoon-fed child of a corrupt totalitarian society, and Strangelove's rebirth after his miraculous recovery from a crippling disease, seem to work well both dramatically and as expressions of an idea. Well, in this kind of world, it's no wonder that there are some who still fiercely oppose the government, or at least the new regime. The character of the writer represents an influential liberal in a world where liberalism is slowly dying. He is a humanitarian, incredibly kind, charitable, and benevolent, going so far as taking people who are in need into his home. And ultimately his goal is to defend the great traditions of liberty. At least this is how he seems at first. When Alex is beaten by the police, the writer takes him in and cares for him, although it becomes apparent that his motives are not completely altruistic. He intends to utilize Alex for political purposes against the government, using him as an example that proves to the public how barbaric the new regime is, thus casting them in a negative light, with the hopes that the new regime will be voted out of power in the upcoming election.
This young boy is a living witness to these diabolical proposals. The people, the common people, must know, must see. There are great traditions of liberty to defend. The tradition of liberty is all.
Now, in any other dystopian tale, the writer would have all the makings of a freedom-fighting hero, if only it weren't for the fact that his methods aren't as freedom-loving as he might like to believe. In fact, he is overtly manipulative, and for Kubrick, the writer's manipulative intentions put him on equal footing with the manipulative government he is fighting against. Kubrick said in an interview that, in the political world of A Clockwork Orange, the minister, played by Anthony Sharp, is clearly a figure of the right. The writer, Patrick McGee, is a lunatic of the left. The common people must be led, driven, pushed, he pants into the telephone. They will sell their liberty for an easier life. The interviewer points out that these could be the very words of a fascist. And Kubrick responds, yes, of course. They differ only in their dogma. Their means and ends are hardly distinguishable. Obviously, Kubrick was a fan of contradictions and paradoxes, and this is perhaps among the most uncomfortable contradictions in his body of work, not least because it has such startling real-world implications. If you are someone who loves liberty, how can you free people who do not want to be free? If people will sell their liberty for an easier life, does it make you an authoritarian if you want to force liberty on them? While not every liberal is a lunatic of the left like the writer, A Clockwork Orange does pose a unique philosophical problem for the liberal or the libertarian who is living in a democratic system that is gradually becoming totalitarian. How do you fight for freedom when the people freely want authoritarianism? This question is never really answered. Instead, Anthony Burgess, the author of the novel itself, simply says that A Clockwork Orange is, ominously, the dream of liberalism going mad, and it is a madness for which we are never given a cure. We are simply left with a nightmare of kindness that opens the door to strangers and gets brutally assaulted. A horribly lucid dream of mercy that fights for the rights of criminals, but when the crime is committed against them, they exact a more cruel vengeance. It was C.S. Lewis who presciently asked, "Are we not really an increasingly cruel age?" Perhaps we are, but I think we have become so in an attempt to reduce all virtues to kindness. For Plato rightly taught that virtue is one. You cannot be kind unless you have all the other virtues. If being cowardly, conceited, and slothful, you have never yet done a fellow creature great mischief, that is only because your neighbor's welfare has not yet happened to conflict with your safety, self-approval, or ease. Every vice leads to cruelty. Even a good emotion, pity, if not controlled by charity and justice, leads through anger to cruelty. Most atrocities are stimulated by accounts of the enemy's atrocities, and pity for the oppressed classes, when separated from the moral law as a whole, leads by a very natural process to the unremitting brutalities of a reign of terror. So far, we've examined the corruption of authoritarian police and politicians who don't stop crime because they are inept or busy perpetrating their own crimes. And we've looked at the microcosm of liberalism that doesn't stop crime because it is both kind to criminals and allows itself to become the prey of criminals, and then subsequently becomes authoritarian, even finding pleasure in cruelty toward criminals. But the third and perhaps greatest enabler of crime in A Clockwork Orange is the weak family. The main example being Alex's parents. In the beginning of the film, they are completely clueless as to who their son is or what he does. They are uninvolved in his life, they believe the lies he tells them, and they have no interest in taking responsibility for him. While they do provide for him, in fact his elderly mother goes to work at a factory to help provide for the family, they are more than happy to get rid of him when he goes to prison. In fact, they are quick to replace him with a paying tenant who takes Alex's room and becomes a kind of provider for his parents.
I mean, I've got you two to think of, who've been like a father and mother to me. Well, it wouldn't be fair now or right, I mean, for me to go off and leave you two to the tender mercies of this young monster.
When Alex returns, they aren't willing to prioritize their son over this new source of income, not even offering him any other kind of help. They would rather be provided for than be providers. But it's not because they have any kind of strong values, or because they disapprove of him, or because they believe in tough love. In fact, they are afraid of Alex and would allow themselves to be bullied by him if it weren't for the effects of the Ludovico technique that stopped him from being violent. It's their naivete, their gullibility, cowardice, and ambivalence that allow their son to commit unspeakable atrocities night after night. And the thing about ambivalent households is that not only do they produce morally deficient individuals, but when they become a feature of a culture rather than an anomaly, they also become helpless victims of those criminals which other ambivalent households produce. At which point, they continue the pattern of ambivalence by shirking the responsibility they have to govern their own households and make them safe, by democratically demanding an authoritarian government to do their fathering and mothering for them. But since the victim class doesn't want the patriarchal-matriarchal responsibility to rule, the only ones left to run the government are from the criminal class, whether petty criminals or white-collar politicians. They are the only ones left with ambition, gumption, and industry. Hence the cycle of chaotic, democratic, failing totalitarianism. Fatherhood and motherhood are indispensable to a functioning and flourishing society. Even in the 19th century, Walt Whitman was advocating for the idea that politics is downstream from culture. But what is culture downstream from, if not from parents? If not from the primal source of all human beings? In his democratic vistas, he argued the absolute necessity, particularly for strong mothers, saying, "I have sometimes thought, indeed, that the sole avenue and means of a reconstructed sociology depended primarily on a new birth, elevation, expansion, invigoration of woman, affording for races to come, as the conditions that antedate birth are indispensable, a perfect motherhood." Great, great indeed, far greater than we know, is the sphere of women. But doubtless the question of such new sociology all goes together, includes many varied and complex influences and premises, and the man as well as the woman, and the woman as well as the man. Society is never greater than its source. It's never greater than the parents who raise the children who make it up. And our communities inevitably reflect the quality of our parents. It's in the household that values are instilled, the heart and the mind is shaped, discipline is administered, and where if a child is given effective instruction, he will not depart from it. If, however, the fundamental building block of the household breaks down and fails to do what it is meant to do, failing to provide for safety, education, and discipline, then not even totalitarianism can prevent or curtail what the household fails to prevent or curtail. Indeed, the only way for authoritarianism to be truly effective, at least when it comes to eradicating crime, squalor, and misery, is not to get rid of the family so much as it is to co-opt the family, or even to become the family itself. At least, this is how Aldous Huxley sketched it in his 1932 novel, Brave New World. Brave New World paints a portrait of an unsettling, utopian world, where human life is controlled from beginning to end. There is no such thing as family or human procreation. Rather, human beings are grown in labs, and from the time they are children, they are conditioned by the world government to behave in a well-defined way. The result is that everyone is happy. Happy and satiated on pleasure. Well, mostly everyone. While the conditioning isn't quite airtight, since at least 2 characters in the novel begin to long for a freedom beyond their conditioning, it is, broadly speaking, much more pervasive and effective than in A Clockwork Orange. Bearing in mind that Brave New World does take place 632 years after Henry Ford introduced the Model T, so maybe conditioning would become effective once human beings have the proper technology. Maybe you can see where I'm going with this, and why I'm bringing up Brave New World in the first place. It's no secret that Brave New World shares a lot of overlap with A Clockwork Orange. The former was an inspiration for the latter, especially with its emphasis on conditioning. But what if the connection is even deeper? What if A Clockwork Orange is actually a prequel to Brave New World? What if A Clockwork Orange is simply the precursor, the dystopian world of misery and crime, where conditioning is introduced, perhaps failing for a while and briefly repudiated, only to be taken up again when the people of that society are finally fed up with the rampant crime and squalor, and finally have the technology that will both eliminate deviant behavior and make them happy. Tired of feeling vulnerable in their own homes and craving nothing but happiness, they demand that all of society be conditioned and given drugs so that physical harm and negative emotions never show their ghastly faces again. My theory might seem like a long shot, and no, Burgess never said that Clockwork was a precursor to Brave New World. But what is a fact is that, according to Huxley, the kind of failing democracy that we see in A Clockwork Orange is the very thing that leads to scientific absolutist totalitarianism. One of the things that's kind of surprising about Huxley's novel is that his vision of one world government run by world controllers who program people down to their DNA doesn't come about as a result of some secret plan by world elites or by authoritarian dictators. It comes about as a result of democracy, or as he says, a revolution of the masses. He writes that whenever the masses seized political power, then it was happiness rather than truth and beauty that mattered. And it was the elevation of happiness as the ultimate ideal that led to the democratic demand for conditioning. Training people not to want anything they can't have, not to think in ways that will make them miserable, to use drugs to enter a state of bliss whenever things go badly. Where have we heard that one before? Oh yeah, we see something similar in A Clockwork Orange. It is a democratic society ruled by the masses who want, more than anything, happiness, pleasure, drugged milk, and safety.
We're not concerned with motives, with a higher ethics. We are concerned only with cutting down crime. And with relieving the ghastly congestion in our prisons.
It's their popular demand for these things that leads to the government brutally conditioning criminals in the name of public safety and happiness. Because after all, isn't it more humane to rehabilitate criminals and release them back into society rather than barbarically locking them up forever? But if you want even more proof for the theory that these two novels exist in the same world, then look no further than the incredible similarities between their two cultures. Despite being separated by some 6 centuries with vastly different governments, technology, and living conditions, the two cultures are essentially different iterations of the same basic culture. Kubrick, for his part, does an amazing job of conveying the culture of his film world through set design, art, architecture, and music. The popular art in A Clockwork Orange is highly demonetizable, ubiquitously erotic, which is culturally significant because erotic art is neither profound nor interesting. It cannot inspire or elevate the mind. It portrays only the most mundane, the basest of human existence. It merely appeals to and expresses the shallow senses, which mirrors the art of Huxley's Brave New World, which is, quote, made out of practically nothing but pure sensation. Sensory erotic art has nothing to say. And this is important in a society that is centered on pleasure and happiness, because to really say something is, according to Huxley, dangerous, and would upset the careful stability and happiness of the people. Authoritarian governments, like that which Huxley depicts, will avoid art that has profound, transcendent meaning in order to maintain social stability. But it's equally worth mentioning that everyday people who want nothing but quiet comfort, safety, and stability will also avoid the sharp teeth of powerful art. They will gravitate toward the mundane, the simplistic, the vulgar, the base, the commonplace, and the everyday.
Leave that alone, don't touch it! It's a very important work of art!
Their highest artistic messages will be dull and uninspiring, and this seems to be the case in A Clockwork Orange, where interior decoration rises scarcely higher than the level of the vulgar. Philosophies and religions which call people to go beyond sensuality will, in these societies, be labeled as the real tyranny, with all their rules implying that man is more than flesh and blood. Though truth be told, what really makes these things dangerous is that they are old, ancient, and enduring. Notice how the art of A Clockwork Orange and the art of Brave New World is exclusively modern art. In fact, in Huxley's novel, old things like Shakespeare are forbidden, simply because they are old. Even when they're beautiful? Asks one protagonist. Particularly when they're beautiful, responds the world controller. Beauty's attractive, and we don't want people to be attracted by old things. We want them to like the new ones. But the new ones are so stupid and horrible. Those plays where there's nothing but helicopters flying about and you feel the people kissing. He made a grimace. Goats and monkeys. Only in Othello's words could he find an adequate vehicle for his contempt and hatred. Nice tame animals, anyhow, the controller murmured parenthetically. And the savage was silent for a while. All the same, he insisted obstinately, Othello's good. Othello's better than those feelies. Of course it is, the controller agreed. But that's the price we have to pay for stability. You've got to choose between happiness and what people used to call high art. We've sacrificed the high art. As for the architecture in A Clockwork Orange, it is unremittingly brutalist, as is that of Brave New World, which we can infer from the very first line of the novel. A squat, gray building of only 34 stories. The building where humans are made and conditioned. It is cold for all the summer beyond the panes. For all the tropical heat of the room itself, wintriness responded to wintriness. The light was frozen, dead, a ghost. Brutalist architecture is harsh, grandiose, and imposing, but still simplistic, cold, and without any soul. Government buildings especially. In A Clockwork Orange, the public housing, the hospital research center are based on the socialist principles from which brutalism emerged. Such buildings are cheap and minimalistic, in order to make thrifty use of the public's funds. They are monuments to equality, since only blank simplicity and absence of character can be equal. They showcase the naked building materials and the structural elements without decoration, or any unnecessary expense. Any attempt to be clothed with any greater beauty or any expression of some high ideal, much like erotic art's base display of naked humanity or isolated body parts. The houses of the middle and upper classes are more homey, yet still minimalistically modern, and oddly uninviting. The surfaces are hard, there's nowhere to relax. Almost like museums. While the house of the cat lady remains an echo of past extravagances, the most ornate designs of this world are to be found in the vestiges of an abandoned and decaying casino, a symbol both of the consequences of careless erstwhile greed and an all but forgotten regard for beauty, left to rot in the wake of the brave new modernity. The fact that A Clockwork Orange was shot on a low budget, and therefore had to rely on real locations for internal and external shots, is a sobering reminder that in many ways, this is our world. This is our decaying extravagance. Our dystopia is already being crafted for us by those who are responsible for the very construction of our buildings. When it comes to the music of A Clockwork Orange, there is a clear class divide in musical tastes. Classical music is preferred by the controlling class, like the government scientists, the television executives, and Alex himself, while the submissive class, like Alex's droogs, scoff at classical music, preferring synthetic pop. And it doesn't seem like a mere coincidence that the music in Huxley's Brave New World is not only completely synthetic, but makes heavy use of simplistic, hypnotic nursery rhymes. Charming, but far from high art, and it rather implies a populace that is kept in a perpetual state of childhood. Kubrick was interviewed about Alex's preoccupation with the more classical music of Beethoven versus the society around him, which seems only to care about modern art, if it cares about art at all. Kubrick responded by saying, "I think modern art's almost total preoccupation with subjectivism has led to anarchy and sterility in the arts. The notion that reality exists only in the artist's mind, and the thing which simpler souls had for so long believed to be reality is only an illusion, was initially an invigorating force, but it eventually led to a lot of highly original, very personal and extremely uninteresting work." In Cocteau's film Orphée, the poet asks what he should do. "Astonish me," he is told. Very little modern art does that. Certainly not in the sense that a great work of art can make you wonder how its creation was accomplished by a mere mortal. Thus, the set design of A Clockwork Orange establishes a society that is unastonished, anesthetized, intellectually self-sedated, drugged and therefore easily and willingly controlled. This is a society of calloused, hollow subjectivism, devoid of any true individuality or originality. A society that only wants to be happy.
They will sell liberty for a quieter life,
and therefore creates mediocre art and drab buildings for a drab world. Since mere happiness, as Huxley wrote in A Brave New World, is never grand. Of course, stability isn't nearly so spectacular as instability, and being contented has none of the glamour of a good fight against misfortune, none of the picturesqueness of a struggle with temptation, or a fatal overthrow by passion or doubt. Happiness is never grand. An encounter with true beauty is too tumultuous of an experience, a reflection of the eternal in time, beckoning man to a higher destiny. Truth and beauty are the enemies of easy, undisturbed, mild tranquility. Huxley wrote poignantly, "You got rid of them." Yes, that's just like you, getting rid of everything unpleasant instead of learning to put up with it. Whether 'tis better in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing, end them. But you don't do either. Neither suffer nor oppose. You just abolish the slings and arrows. It's too easy. Dystopia comes from taking the easy path, by trying to abolish all problems, ills, discomforts, and evils. The proper response to trouble and evil, and the only way to preserve a dignified liberty, is to face whatever is bad, not begging the sloppy and corrupt state machine to end our problems, but to face them ourselves, and by opposing, end them. You know, pray not for easy lives, pray to be stronger men. I could rehearse platitudes all day, but I think Stanley Kubrick himself best sums up the challenge which his own film presents to us. The challenge of carefully balancing law and order with freedom, of balancing safety with an allowance for danger and evil. He said, "I am certainly not an anarchist, and I don't think of myself as a pessimist. I believe very strongly in parliamentary democracy, and I am of the opinion that the power and authority of the state should be optimized and exercised only to the extent that is required to keep things civilized. History has shown us what happens when you try to make society too civilized, or do too good a job of eliminating undesirable elements. It also shows the tragic fallacy in the belief that the destruction of democratic institutions will cause better ones to arise in their place. Certainly, one of the most challenging and difficult social problems we face today is, how can the state maintain the necessary degree of control over society without becoming repressive? And how can it achieve this in the face of an increasingly impatient electorate who are beginning to regard legal and political solutions as too slow? The state sees the specter looming ahead of terrorism and anarchy, and this increases the risk of its overreaction and a reduction in our freedom. As with everything else in life, it is a matter of groping for the right balance, and a certain amount of luck. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. It always means the world to me when people watch these videos all the way to the very end. And speaking of meaningful things, I want to give a huge thank you to the people who've been supporting me on Patreon, especially as I've had to take this lengthy break from YouTube, not by my own will. And the fact that you all have continued to support me even though I haven't been able to make videos, that really means more to me than I can ever put into words. So thank you for that. I am glad to finally be back working on videos, and I have a couple other videos on A Clockwork Orange that I want to get out, hopefully within the next month before moving on to another topic. So be on the lookout for those. I hope that these discussions are thought-provoking, if nothing else. Kubrick's films, and A Clockwork Orange in particular, have a way of being offensive to everyone, but they're also obviously very enriching if you don't take yourself too seriously, but also take yourself seriously with that kind of Socratic Kierkegaardian irony. You know, like Pascal said, to make light of philosophy is to be a true philosopher. Yet, at the same time, we take life very seriously. And that's obviously the approach I generally take. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. I really appreciate you being here, and I look forward to seeing you all again in the comments.